Yeah, so when obviously I was asked to do this, or offered this sort of studio here at Anchor, I was quite surprised. It wasn't somewhere where I was expecting to be sort of invited to somehow. It wasn't kind of particularly, obviously I knew about Porthmeor and the Newlyn school, but very much it was based in a very painterly history as far as I was concerned. So, and I was really, quite touched to be asked, because I think being asked to be within that context is quite different from my normal, traditional places that I'd show and whatever. So, but when I came down here, I actually thought, well, I'm not going to make anything. I'm just going to perhaps do some drawing and some reading and and just use the space as a more contemplative space, because also I have huge amounts of storage problems, as you might imagine. So I don't really want to produce any more. But so, in a sense, what we're looking at in here is, I wouldn't call it a show, but potentially it might be a show at some point. But it's the thing that I thought I wouldn't do in a way, which I couldn't help myself. And as you said, I've been collating I've been collating material down here, from pretty much from the fish sheds around to the slipway and just beyond, a pretty small area, pretty much. And yeah, this is where I'm at. I mean, probably the first place to start is this, which is unfinished. I started making it and just stopped, so it just sits as it is. And this, in a sense, is a thing that somehow bookends a certain period, because in a way it refers to a work I made in 1996 or 7, which was called an Amnesiacs beach fire, which I first made on a residency, which I think in a way this is the kind of first residency I've done in such a way as this since then. And so that we're kind of looking at nearly 30 years back, and years ago, I was applied for this residency in Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is called the Berwick Gymnasium, which at the time was a really kind of strangely happening place back in the mid-90s. And when I went up there, I wrote a proposal which was based on, it was actually a theoretical essay on Soviet science fiction, which talked about Soviet science fiction writers such as Stanislav Lem and Boris and Arkady Strugatsky writing books around the idea of the human condition, but also the kind of human condition within the Soviet Union, but in such a low form of genre that the Soviet authorities didn't censor it. So it kind of came out, they could speak to their own people, but also these books were published in the West as well. So having become interested in that, I decided to make an application to Berwick-upon-Tweed, where I dumbed it down to an even lower genre of the biker genre of the early 70s, which was normally published by the New English Library, and to turn Stanislav Lem's cosmonauts from Solaris into bikers. So the helmets of the cosmonauts became the bikers' helmets in a biker gang, and the biker gang were called the Amnesiacs, and they were somehow scanning the beaches of the North Sea, looking for the debris and detritus, and somehow trying to make sense of this detritus like it was a language laid out across all the coastlines of that coast of Northumberland, but all the coasts of the world. So it's something that could be applied to anywhere. And one of the first and most emblematic, one of the last works I made on that exhibition, but probably one of the most emblematic was these beach fires, which, to all intents and purposes, the fire to me is something that talks about humanity, it's that shift, I suppose, in terms of language, but in terms of heat, in terms of kind of cooking, in terms of light, and in terms of cinema in many ways. Obviously the fire within a cave flickering against the drawings on a wall were the earliest form of cinema in many ways. So, but the Amnesiacs built them as images of a fire, and they have no capacity for light, they have no capacity for heat, no capacity for cooking. So in a sense it kind of drains it of all humanity. And in a way, these fires I've been making ever since, over the years, since the 1990s. I mean, if you know my work, things tend to reoccur and get re-dragged up and reused and remade into different things. So when I first came here, I thought, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to build a fire, sort of like, because I kind of felt the space needed a fire. But then, actually, there's not many fires around here. It's sort of like, you know, up in Northumberland and, you know, down in Kent, you can find old burnt bits of wood on the beaches very easily. Sort of and you pick them up and you're trying to reconstruct this fire that somebody had made or burnt, and then reconstruct it back into this image of almost like an encyclopedic image of a fire. But I didn't really find it. I found these strange fragments on. These are actually from Sennan Cove, so this is the one thing that's not from Newlyn. And then I found some old sticks downstairs, sort of like, I made this grid. So I thought, well, I'll join it together on a grid. So this, and I think this is perhaps where the sort of like, obviously the history of the studio in terms of the Newlyn School, but also the sort of the modernist history that, I mean, I remember I dragged out this bench from the basement because when I came up there was this kind of horrific sort of like a fake Barcelona sofa that was really pissing me off, sort of like, so I had to take it apart and move it downstairs because I couldn't deal with all this soft furnishing. So within this section, and tried to kind of make the space kind of empty again, but I found the bench downstairs, so I pulled this back out, and I think you know, Chris told me that this was you know, John Garbo's and John Wells and Garbo's bench, sort of like years ago. So yeah, it seemed a particularly nice thing to kind of pull up and bring back into the space, especially if you look up at the image to the left. Actually, there's a very strong sort of relationship to that work from the asset strippers at the Tate. So the idea of a workbench, somehow its history, sort of what that history actually talks about, the absence of the people that have used it. So I built this grid to join these kind of burnt sort of sections of sort of timber. So yeah, so having made that, then I'm straight back onto my first residency in '96, back onto the beach. In '97, I couldn't resist it. So my reading and writing and drawing sort of like studio disappeared, and I was back to pulling these materials back off. So perhaps I'll run through the ideas of what kind of, I think this collection of disparate matter sort of ties up in terms of my own kind of thinking, in that having made sort of the Amnesiacs back in 1996, 97, which was a sort of a complicated story. I mean, if, obviously the kind of the idea of the politic, the idea of like a slightly a populist sort of like dumbed down way of communicating sort of matter and material to talk about the human condition was then sort of like made directly with in reference to sort of Solaris, say, and I think the work was more complicated by the story of Solaris was bound up with the main protagonist Chris Kelvin sort of forcing his girlfriend into suicide, and then if you know the story, the film or the book, the cosmonauts' memories are sort of somehow penetrated by the ocean, which is a sentient ocean, and it sort of makes the aspects of their memory sort of real, into real hallucinations. And the main protagonist's girlfriend, who committed suicide partly because of his behaviour, appears back in the sort of like in the space station, and she doesn't know she's a hallucination as well. So, so parallel to this, I'd been working with a very close friend, sort of Erlen Williamson, who I was at Chelsea with, who the first weekend fell off a mountain, sort of like, and died in a rock climbing accident. And in a way, sort of like the complication of that story in terms of kind of loss and absence, sort of like was kind of aggravated by his death, and very much changed the work in some ways. So I think that body of work was very much bound up with that, and I did a couple more shows, one in Copenhagen, sort of like with the Amnesiacs, and then they sort of disappeared for about a decade until I think it was in 2004 or maybe it's 2006 for my third show at Matt's gallery. I made a work called Amnesiac Shrine, or Double Coop Displacement. The idea of the Amnesiac Shrine was somehow that the Amnesiacs, as this kind of gang of bikers that had been helping me, somehow had sort of been silently shadowing me for sort of a decade. and somehow taking on the imagery and sort of motifs and structures of sort of other artists that I was interested in or made reference to, and then they kind of come together to make these shrines, and these shrines somehow took the structures and motifs of these artists, but without any knowledge of where they were from or what their meaning actually was. And I suppose I made the analogy, and in regard to the title in terms of shrines, that you could, if you were smoking a cigarette on the street, but then it's a cigarette, and then if you took a cigarette and put it on a shrine, it becomes an offering to the gods, sort of like in a bowl you might eat your dinner out of or your supper, then taken to a shrine becomes a sort of receptacle to sort of like to take sort of like the blood of a sort of like a sacrifice. So in a way I wanted to construct a work that somehow was both a shrine and sort of like and somehow in regard to the belief within this sort of structure of art in terms of making art, but to take these structures of other artists but to reuse them in a sort of blind way, but became like a devotional sort of structure at the same time. So that piece, the double coupe displacement, was a double steel cage but built as Paul Tech's artist co-op, which was a chicken coop, a play on the word of co-op and coop, and the displacement of Robert Smithson thrown in. So in a sense there's this kind of history in regard to sort of the Amnesiacs. And so when I came to here and started sort of collecting these objects, I kind of naturally found there's a sort of like slight sense of this matter, these material, these objects kind of coming out of the ocean, which again, within the ocean on Solaris in sort of like Lem's novel, there's these things called mimoids where the ocean would kind of suddenly swell up and form these kind of hallucinogenic sort of objects within the ocean, sort of like, and somehow to me, in doing that, again, I kept finding these things which reminded me of, you know, almost like they'd thrown out these pieces of modernity, like, I'd see the work in the middle over there with the two eye holes, almost like a Hepworth, and I'd see the sort of like the three small bits of steel just lent together, sort of with a piece of an old bumper of a boat, I think, sort of like but nothing else done to it, sort of. I'd see that as almost like a three-dimensional Alfred Wallace, a sort of an attempt to make some sort of Nicholson-esque sort of bit of modernity out of a bit of steel and a steel ring, like a more kind of a Moore-esque owl, the Picasso-esque sort of like trophy heads, kind of the Morandi with the broken bottles, and so there's this sort of sense of a sort of the ocean somehow here, and the John Chamberlain, a kind of a miniature John Chamberlain, sort of like just straight out. And I think with this kind of way of working of this sort of landscape of matter and objects, what I kind of like is the fact that it's kind of nothing and everything somehow. So this is a very sort of notional kind of, it's not an exhibition, but display of matter, where I think things are both something and nothing at the same time, and both slipping in and out of a focus in terms of meaning, of sort of like currency, of sort of like of materiality, sort of like and straight back to what actually they are. And I think in doing that, it's almost like a sort of miniature, sort of like it's like one of those sort of miniature village versions of the Asset Strippers somehow, but with a much stronger sort of like basis on the Amnesiacs. So if anybody saw the Asset Strippers in Tate Britain, which was 2019, I think, this was a huge exhibition of ginormous kind of like monumental sculptures, which were made from a different type of sea, in a sense, sort of like it was from, I accessed all the matter from the workshops, the factories, and the end of industry in Britain, to all intents and purposes, that was being sort of dismantled. So in many ways I saw the internet in the same sort of guise as the sentient ocean in some ways in Solaris, and used that to sort of access this matter and then to build these monumental sculpture. And in the same way, sitting within Tate Britain, sort of like, with the surrounding galleries sort of like full of the Lynn Chadwicks, the Moores, the sort of like Epsteins, sort of like the resonance of these machines that sort of like that had been used and actually facilitated the making of a lot of that kind of modernist sort of sculpture of the post-war period, or pre-war even, sort of like they both kind of resembled, but also sort of like emulated. But also there was that sort of sense of the anthropomorphism of like of both humans, of beasts, of animals. I mean, you know, again, making the asset strippers, I was really looking to sort of like respond to the sort of like idea of the Devine galleries as really a sort of a contemporary sculpture's response to the lower galleries of the British Museum and the cast rooms of the V&A, and this idea of a space of monumental sculpture. But what monumental sculpture would be in Britain at this point, and of course, that's what drew me to this sort of like these rather sad relics, you know, in many ways of the world I'd grown up in, my parents had grown up in many ways. So, in some senses, one can think of this in relation to that sort of, and so in many ways, if this has been of use to me, then in a sense, there's a making sense of that kind of relationship between the Amnesiacs and between sort of like the asset strippers and between the idea of the Amnesiac shrine and these ideas that have run through the work for years in many ways, sort of, but also the constant problem of the studio, which is also another sort of a subject that's kind of close to my heart, because I spoke before that I never really had a studio for a very long time. I used to have a pickup truck, and back in the 90s and 2000s, and that was kind of the studio, that and a metal toolbox bolted to the back, and just moving from space to space and building things within them. And it's an old habit I thought I might be able to break here, but I think I've done exactly what I always do, so I think it's slightly kind of problematic in those terms.